Okay, well, welcome to another Facebook Live hosted by Regnum Legacy. My name is James Long. I'm the owner and founder of Regnum Legacy, and we're going to be talking about voter fraud today. Even though I'm an estate planner, voter fraud is something that we should all be concerned about, particularly when the allegations of voter fraud could potentially alter a really important election. And there's a lot of sort of talk on social media and in like my Facebook feed and Instagram feed and Twitter feed over what's going on in this election, and a lot of sentiment out there that why can't they just call it? Why can't they just tell us who's the winner? And so I wanted to take a look at the voter fraud allegations because yesterday we talked about how the vote is actually counted and what the process is in each state to count the vote. And you know, I made a comment that it would be a little bit hard to actually substantially alter a vote with all of the checks and balances that are in place during an election like this. You have several layers of checks and several layers of people that go into verifying each vote and making sure that everything's on the up and up. You've got election poll watchers from the Republican side and from the Democrat side, all monitoring things so that there's no irregularities and those kinds of things. And now we're starting to hear that for example, some Republican poll watchers weren't allowed in to particular polling places, or we're hearing stories about Sharpies being used on the Arizona ballots, and we're hearing or we're watching videos of ballots that were allegedly cast for Donald Trump being burned, and we're watching all sorts of opinion about what's going on out there. And on the other side, we're also hearing a lot of sentiment and opinions about whether voter fraud actually exists. I saw let me pull it up here. I just saw a article. It's called "The Myth of Voter Fraud" by the Brennan Center for Justice, and the conclusion there is that voter fraud doesn't really exist as fraud as such. It doesn't really exist, and it's exceedingly rare. And so it struck me as just very odd that you'd have this sort of deep sentiment on a lot of persons' feeds or opinions that there's something fishy going on, and you have another sentiment that this type of thing can't happen in this country. This type of thing just isn't what goes on in America. So I wanted to take a look at it, and last night, let me just see here. You'll have to forgive the 5 o'clock shadow, by the way, because I forgot that it's November and apparently you're not supposed to shave. So I've got my rich, wonderful, glorious winter beard coming in here, and so that's why I might look like a hobo right now. Let's see here. So from the Heritage Foundation, this was an interesting fact that I found out, or that I looked up, and the Heritage Foundation has compiled a list of voter fraud cases. You can go there on heritage.org/voter fraud. And at least according to them, now I haven't researched each and in every individual case, so take this for what it is. You can go and look at Heritage and see what sources they found and verify their findings yourself. I'm just, letting you know what I found. Apparently, there's been in the last 20 years almost 1,300 proven instances of voter fraud. Of those 1,300 proven instances of voter fraud, about 1,121 have resulted in criminal convictions, and the rest have resulted in civil penalties or other types of, diversion programs and things like that. Now, I say that because it struck me as really odd that you would have so many proven instances of voter fraud, yet you would have a group like the Brennan Center say that voter fraud's a myth. And I've heard a lot of even some of my friends who are lawyers, talk about how hard it would be to commit voter fraud, and that the type of voter fraud that's being alleged is just impossible. And when I look at the Brennan Center opinion, here's kind of where I think people are splitting hairs, and this is maybe we're talking about semantics here. and we're talking past each other. So let me kind of break it down so that we can start talking the same language, so that we can all know what we're talking about when we say voter fraud. For example, the Brennan Center says that most allegations of fraud turn out to be baseless, and that most of the few remaining allegations reveal irregularities and other forms of election misconduct. So the Brennan Center there is sort of quibbling with the term fraud. They're saying, well, fraud doesn't really exist, but misconduct and irregularities, quote unquote, do. From my perspective, if there is some sort of voter misconduct or election irregularities, I kind of think that's fraud. And I think we're right to lump those kinds of things in together. Now, where the Brennan Center is right is I have not been able to find, and even on Heritage, I haven't been able to find an instance where an entire city government, maybe, or election board was involved in widespread, quote unquote, fraud, where just 200,000 ballots are just being shoved into the system fraudulently. That's not the kind of thing I've seen, at least in the 1,300 cases reported on Heritage. But at the same time, I think it's a little disingenuous to say that voter fraud is a myth when even the people who are saying it's a myth at least readily admit that voter misconduct happens and occurs. And it apparently occurs to the tune of 1,300 proven cases in the last 20 years and just over 1,100 criminal convictions for voter fraud. But let me get into some of the numbers here because this is really fascinating to me. The Heritage Foundation found that 20 instances of voter fraud in the last 20 years, 20 instances of voter fraud resulted in overturned elections, which is, a far cry from just irregularities and misconduct. We're talking about substantive acts that actually affect elections, so much so that in the last 20 years, 20 instances where an election was overturned. And if you do the math, 20 divided by 20 is 1. So what is that? 1 per year. And to my mind, that's far too many. But let's talk about, in this election cycle, the states of Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan. Those states have been sort of under heavy scrutiny. And Donald Trump has called for a recount in Wisconsin. They want voting to stop in Pennsylvania, and they want everyone to kind of slow their roll so they can get their lawsuits filed. And so I took a look at those states to see whether any instance has occurred where an election was overturned in those states. And it turns out that only 2, Georgia and North Carolina, have had elections overturned due to voter fraud. North Carolina twice and Georgia once. But Georgia has the most recent. In 2018, a local election was overturned due to voter fraud. And in North Carolina, you've had, North Carolina's had 3 instances, excuse me. North Carolina's had 3 instances of voter fraud. Ironically, 2 of them have come from the same city, the city of Pembroke. So in 2016 and 2014, the local elections in Pembroke, North Carolina, were overturned due to voter fraud, at least according to this these Heritage Foundation results. And in 2016, another city in North Carolina was also, local election there was also overturned. So these kinds of things do happen, and I wouldn't be naive to think that they don't happen in larger elections like a presidential election, particularly where we've got a hugely contested election with a very, at least on one side, maybe both sides, I'm not sure, but at least one side, a very unpopular candidate. It would be naive to think that there wouldn't be at least someone trying to unduly influence the vote there. So I dug even further and pulled the statistics from all the states, if you're interested here. And in the state of Pennsylvania, there have been, Pennsylvania is interesting because there's actually been one instance where there was an altered vote count. The voter fraud actually altered the count of the vote. and that was in 2016. But there's been the Heritage Foundation. Let me just preface this by saying that they break up their instances of voter fraud into different categories. For example, there's a type of fraud where you are impersonating someone at the polls. You're either pretending to be someone you're not, or you're using a person who has died. You're using their identity to issue a vote. That would be called like impersonation fraud. There's false registrations where you register to vote in a town or a county you don't live in so that you could either contribute more to that particular vote. Like, for example, I live in California, and it would be fraud for me to go pretend to live in, I don't know, Arizona, just so that I can vote in that election where it's a little more competitive in California. And I suppose I've just tipped my hand at where my political leanings are. I'm a conservative, by the way. Don't hate me now. Half the stream's just cut off because they don't like me anymore. Just kidding. You guys love me. But that's what false registration would be. A duplicate voting, clearly that would be an instance where it's a type of fraud where a person votes twice or 3 times or 4 times or multiple times. There are instances of fraudulent use of absentee ballots, instances where votes are bought, illegal assistance at the polls where someone is coerced or intimidated to change their vote or vote in a way they don't want to. Ineligible voting by either people who are not citizens or felons or otherwise ineligible to vote for whatever reason. And so those are the types of frauds that the Heritage Foundation sort of breaks their cases down. So that 1,300 number that I mentioned are broken down further into these other types of cases. And so in Pennsylvania, in the last 20 years, there have been 2 proven cases of voter fraud where someone has impersonated a dead person, 5 instances where it's been proven that someone falsely registered, 1 instance where somebody voted more than once, 5 instances where there was a fraudulent use of absentee ballots, and then 1 instance where they were actually altering the vote count. And this was involved 2 people. There was a team of 2 people to accomplish this altered vote count, and it happened in a local election the election was in May of 2014, a local election there. The conviction was in 2016, and it was a conviction for rigging the election there. That happened in Pennsylvania. In Arizona, this was kind of interesting. There have been 2 instances of false registrations over the last 20 years, but 19 instances of duplicate voting. 19 instances of duplicate voting. That was the highest instance of duplicate voting I could find in these contested states, which was 19 instances of duplicate voting. There have been 1 instance of fraudulent use of absentee ballots and 2 ineligible votes proven in Arizona. If you want to go to Nevada, we've got 4 false registrations over the last 20 years, 2 duplicate votes, and 1 ineligible vote. So Nevada's got sort of compared to the rest, a cleaner record, if you will, although it's a less populous state, so maybe that makes sense. Georgia's kind of interesting because I don't know what it is about the southern states, but they're the only ones I could find where there were instances where people bought votes or paid to have someone vote a particular way. So in Georgia, you've got 3 false registrations, 1 duplicate vote, 10 instances of the fraudulent use of absentee ballots, 2 votes bought. I wonder how much they cost. Didn't say, but that's kind of interesting. 3 instances of illegal assistance at the polls. That's a circumstance where someone was coerced or things like that. And then North Carolina, we've got false registrations, 1, duplicate voting, 4, 2 fraudulent uses of absentee ballots, 2 votes bought, and then North Carolina had the highest instance of these contested states for ineligible voters, 21 proven instances of ineligible votes in North Carolina. And then finally, this is the last state, so this is the last data we're going to be going through. So just we'll aggregate it in a second and tell you what it means. But in Wisconsin, there have been 7 false registrations, 9 duplicate votes, 4 fraudulent uses of absentee ballots, and 22 ineligible votes. Okay, wait, maybe, yeah, Wisconsin was the highest. Sorry, I didn't mean to disparage North Carolina so unjustly. It was Wisconsin who has the privilege of these 6 states to have the highest number of ineligible votes proven in the last 20 years. So, way to go, Wisconsin. All right, so what does all this tell you? This tells you a couple of things. It tells you, number one, that voter fraud is real. So all the hysteria out there about voter fraud, and then the counter argument that, oh, come on, voter fraud doesn't really exist. It's a myth. It's just something that the losing side says to, prolong the election results. That's just not true. Voter fraud is something that does happen and does happen in every state, and it does happen to a significant clip to the states that are currently being contested right now. All right. Now, does that mean that, or does it make it more likely that these allegations that we're hearing now, the Sharpie, so-called Sharpie Gate in Arizona, and the ballots that were being burned, and the other instances of voter fraud that have been alleged, does it make it more likely that those instances are true? Absolutely not. All this data does is say that, yes, voter fraud does exist. Yes, our system is imperfect. And the data does show that, yes, voter fraud does exist significantly enough to change the outcome of elections, such that 20 times in the last 20 years, elections have been overturned because of voter fraud. Now, what you have to do with these allegations that are coming out is actually scrutinize the facts and kind of do your own research and digging. For example, here's what I found out in Arizona. My wife brought this to my attention last night. She showed me a post of somebody who had voted in Arizona. They checked their ballot. Their ballot said that the ballot was canceled, and that person believed it was due to the Sharpies that were being used because the Sharpies caused bleed through. Bleed through is where, if I write on a piece of paper, oh geez, I don't know if this will bleed through. Kind of. So right here on this piece of paper, I've just circled that piece of paper. If I go to the back, you could see the bleed through right there, right? That's what's called bleed through. And so the concern is with that the Sharpies that were being used as you bubble in your choice for president, it's going to bleed through to the back of the ballot. And on the back are other candidates. There are other options you'll remember from your own ballot. You had a front and a back. And so the concern is that when that bleed through goes through, it's going to basically count a double vote and invalidate your ballot. The election officials in Arizona have come out, and since this allegation was made, have come out and flat out denied that the bleed through would be a problem. They did confirm that Sharpies were used, and actually confirmed that Sharpies are preferred. I've never been told to use a Sharpie, and in all my years of voting, I've never even seen anyone use a Sharpie. So that seems odd that all of a sudden Sharpies are the preferred way to go, but I've never voted in Arizona, so who knows? But nevertheless, what they said was, they admitted that Sharpies were used, but what they say is that their voter machines are calibrated to ignore bleed through. In other words, a ballot that has been penned in with a Sharpie and has a bleed through would not be invalidated because the voting machines ignore the bleed through on the back. Here's one of the things that I find a little bit disturbing about that explanation. Number one, they didn't explain the extent to which the voting machines ignore the bleed through. For example, I've seen pictures of some of these ballots, or I don't know if it's an actual ballot or maybe a provisional ballot of some sort that was marked with a Sharpie, and the bleed through on the back actually looked like a mark. Like the bleed through was so significant, it made an actual full round mark on the back of the ballot, and it made it so that the back choices for the candidates, it was confusing as to which person you were voting for because the circle was so pronounced. So one of the problems with the explanation was that I don't know the extent or how finely tuned that calibration is. And I really think that the election officials in Arizona, to kind of build trust in the election system, should do a live demonstration. They should just take a ballot machine, take a ballot, get a ballot with significant bleed through and show us that it doesn't invalidate the ballot. Because there's a couple things that we know. We know, one, that the Sharpies were used. That's been admitted. We know, two, from the photos that the bleed through was significant. And three, we know that some people who voted have found that their ballots have now been canceled. So we have to find a way to explain all these things. And frankly, Arizona hasn't explained it significantly enough to explain why those ballots were canceled if the bleed through is truly being ignored. And would the ballot machine ignore the significant bleed through that we see in the photos? That's something I just don't know. Now, I don't know that that amounts to voter fraud. The allegation there is that only Republicans or Sharpies were only given to or used in areas that were high Republican vote type areas, Maricopa County and things like that, I think. And so if that were true, that would be an instance of sort of widespread voter fraud at the highest levels to make sure that that the officials there were using Sharpies in particular areas to invalidate votes. That would be the allegation. I think that's far less likely than maybe just incompetence. That doesn't change the fact that we need to investigate whether the bleed through issue actually canceled votes. So if you're in Arizona, go check your ballot. If you used a Sharpie, check your ballot to see if it's been counted or if it's been canceled. Because we could solve this right now. If all the people who used Sharpies would go check the status of their ballots and see were they canceled or accepted, we could get a good sense about whether or not these ballot machines are properly calibrated to ignore the bleed through or not. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is the video that's been circulating on gosh, it must be Twitter or maybe Instagram or something, of somebody allegedly burning Trump ballots. So if you haven't seen the video, it's a video of somebody, you can't see the person's face or really any identifying type things, but it's a video of him holding a bag of what he claims are at least 80 Trump ballots. And you know, he shows the ballots, show that they're marked for Donald Trump, and then he pours lighter fluid on them and burns them, as he says, you know, F Trump and things like that. And so the allegation there is obviously evidence of some sort of voter fraud, maybe an election official or somebody who had access to ballots, maybe a ballot collector, or I don't know how they do it in that particular state, but somebody who had access to ballots who are now burning Trump ballots. The election officials out there, I think it was in Virginia, the election officials came out there and said that those ballots weren't official ballots. Now, if you'll go back and think back to your own ballots, I'm thinking to my own ballot because I don't know what a Virginia ballot looks like, but what their explanation was the provisional or sample ballots didn't have a barcode at the bottom, whereas official ballots have a barcode. Now, in California, the ballots that we used or we received that in the mail all had the barcode at the bottom. It was something that would be presumably scanned to know what ballot went out, and they could presumably check to see if that's the same ballot that came in, I assume. But there's a barcode there. So their explanation kind of makes sense from my own experience, although I've never seen an official Virginia ballot. But what they're saying and what a lot of media outlets are reporting is that allegation that Trump votes were burned is false, and that whatever the video is showing either sample ballots or maybe provisional ballots or some sorts of other unofficial type ballots being burned as a hoax or as a way to probably stow unrest in the country or get Trump voters upset or whatever else. There's another, the final issue I want to talk about is an issue that was raised by a law professor, old law professor of mine, who this isn't necessarily voter fraud, but it's an interesting issue that you might see come up. And here's what allegedly happened. Apparently, in some portions of Philadelphia or in Pennsylvania, largely in more heavily Democratic areas, ballot workers assisted voters to help them complete what otherwise would be an invalid ballot. Yesterday, you'll remember we talked about what a legal ballot is or an invalid ballot, and that there's all sorts of requirements for what you have to do in order to have a valid ballot. One of those is, for example, you've got to sign your name on the envelope and all sorts of things. And so what the allegation is that as people were turning in the ballots, there was some sort of flaw or defect, and the poll worker there helped those persons cure the defect. In other words, reminded them, hey, you forgot to sign here, or this portion is incompleted, or something. And on its face, that kind of thing doesn't necessarily seem fraudulent or seem unfair. But the point that this particular professor raised was that type of thing wasn't done universally. It was only done in this Democratic, this stronghold for a lot of Democratic voters. And so the argument there is that that would have disenfranchised Trump voters in other areas because that similar type of help wasn't offered in more rural areas, which are dominated by people who vote for Trump. I don't think that's an instance of voter fraud necessarily, but it's something that you could see come up in a legal challenge or be talked about more as an aspect of either something that needs to be cured for next election or finding a way to identify these votes and determine what should happen to them. Because at this point, it seems like there would be no way to cure that defect or understand how many ballots were helped versus not. And I'm not sure if Pennsylvania has a system for checking that or not. There is a system in a lot of states. If someone's assisted you with your ballot, you've got to write their name on the ballot so that you can know. And certainly if that were the case, it would be easy to identify which ballots were assisted on or not, and those could be presumably set aside. But that's a type of voting, maybe you want to say irregularity, that wouldn't rise, to my mind, wouldn't rise to the fraudulent type of action, more of a unfairness action, that it's done in this particular area and not that particular area. So that's something to keep an eye out for. But after listening to all this, there's a couple of things you should take away. Number one, that voter fraud is real. It does happen, and it does happen often enough that several hundred a year are processed and criminally convicted for voter fraud. It happens often enough that 20 elections in the last 20 years have been overturned due to voter fraud. Never a widespread national election like this. They primarily seem to be limited to local elections, but this being such a hotly contested election, I think we need to be extra vigilant. The second thing you should take away is that over the next couple of days, take what you read on social media with a grain of salt. Take the allegations that you see on social media with a grain of salt. Some of them are going to be true, some of them are going to be false, and some of them we just don't know. And so I know this election is causing a lot of people stress, and people, if you voted for Trump, are hearing all this talk about voter fraud, and it might be causing you to smoke more cigarettes than usual or drink more than usual. I'm saying smoke your normal cigarettes, drink your normal drinks, because right now what we need to do is be vigilant. We need to investigate, and we need to not overreact and cast maybe aspersions or other types of allegations when things possibly could be unfounded. And wait to see what the facts come in. And if you're an election official, we ought to demand from our election officials clarity as to what the process is like going forward. For example, in Arizona, their explanation about the bleed through seems credible and it seems logical, but I need to know more to know whether or not the bleed through that we see in some of the photos actually affected the vote. And if it did, what can we do to correct it? Is there anything we can do to correct it? And some of that's going to depend on Arizona voters. You're just going to have to go and check your ballots to see if it was counted or not. And there's ways to do that on your Secretary of State website in your states. So that's all for today on voter fraud. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. If you've got any questions, let me know. I'm going to check the feed here. Of course, my screen just went black. Here we go. Questions. We've got here, I don't know if this is a question so much as a comment. I believe the president is using the issue of voter fraud to delegitimize the election as a whole. Voter fraud does, of course, happen and absolutely matters, but unless the election is lost by 1 to 5 votes in these states, then it's more a symbolic litigation process. But yes, voter fraud is real. Jose, I agree with you to some extent. I don't know if the president is using this issue to delegitimize the election. I think that the president is using this issue to call to mind or to slow the roll, if you will. I don't think he wants Joe Biden declared the victor too early, if you will. He wants to cast enough doubt so that his legal team can get the battles out so that they can kind of draw this out as long as possible. But I don't think he's trying to delegitimize it. I could be wrong, but I just don't think that. I think that you're right, though, that a lot of these cases of voter fraud, I haven't found a single one where it's come down to like widespread hundreds of thousands of votes and things like that. And so you're right in that sense that it might not, there might be a couple of instances this year of voter fraud or things like that. And maybe it makes no difference, but it's something that we ought to be not concerned about, but vigilant of and not dismissive of. And so that's that. Here's another question. Have you heard anything about the Homeland Security putting a watermark on the official ballots? I haven't heard anything about that. That would be interesting because then you could figure out if that's true. You could figure out which ballots were or were not correct. I think it would be surprising to me because balloting and voting in federal elections is a state issue, and I don't think that the Department of Homeland Security would have any control over what ballots look like in the individual states. I could be wrong. Maybe they do. I just don't know if that's true or not because I haven't heard anything about it. But it would be one way if it were true to figure out if a ballot was real or not. Any other questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, aspersions? Nothing. Excellent. All right. Well, stay vigilant out there. Remember that, yeah, voter fraud might exist, but as Jose reminded us, it might not matter. But it could matter. So let's stay vigilant and demand that our election officials look at things. Oh, he's going to send me a link. Fantastic. By the way, he is my dad. So thanks, Dad. All right. We'll see you next time, guys.